Again for being here today. We're entering the final stretch of the Iran talks with just about 6 weeks left before the June 30th deadline to reach a comprehensive nuclear deal. The progress that's been made over the past 2 years is really quite incredible. We've had over 15 months of successful implementation of the interim agreement, and on April 2nd, parameters were announced to guide the drafting of the final agreement that, from a non-proliferation standpoint, are very strong. And from our perspective at ACA, a deal is not only possible at this point, but it's probable. So I'm very excited today to have a panel to discuss where we are now in the talks, what remains to be done, and then look a little bit at implementation of the final deal. So to start off today, we have Richard Nephew. Richard is the Program Director on the Economic Statecraft, Sanctions, and Energy Markets with the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. And prior to joining Columbia University, he was the Principal Deputy Coordinator for Sanctions Policy at the State Department, a position which he held beginning in 2013. So he has been on the ground at the Iran talks until he took up his post at Columbia. Following Richard, we have Ariane Tabatabai. She's an associate at the Balfour Center's International Security Program and Project on Managing the Atom, and is now a visiting assistant professor at Georgetown University. And she is going to give us a look at some of the dynamics inside Iran and reactions to the nuclear deal and the announcements that have been made thus far. So we'll start with you, Richard.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for being here. I think these are very interesting conversations. Oh, that would help. These are interesting conversations, even more if the microphone is on. I'm looking forward to offering you a few thoughts, and then most importantly, having a bit of a conversation afterwards. You know, I think I was asked to talk a little bit about sanctions relief in the comprehensive plan of action that hopefully will be concluded by the end of June, and in particular, how to bridge whatever gap may exist between the P5+1 Iranian positions, but also what they're saying in public and what this means really in terms of the talks. And I think my fundamental conclusion would be that even though there is a gap in how the parties are talking about sanctions relief, I don't think that there is a real gap in understanding what will need to be part of a comprehensive deal. And nor do I think that there is a fundamental gap on what will need to happen on the Iranian side and on the P5+1 side to make sanctions relief a reality. I think what's really at the heart of the debate that is happening in public between Iran and the P5+1 is a messaging problem. And it's a messaging problem that frankly speaks to the heart of the Iran nuclear issue. I think, you know, like Kelsey said, I believe that a deal at this point is highly likely coming out of the end of June. But I also think that at the end of June, there is still going to be a strong dissimilarity between what the P5+1 and what Iran is saying about how sanctions relief is going to be implemented. And you can already see a number of people scratching their heads saying, well, how can that be when the deal is done? That should be the time in which there is clarity between the sides. But I think at the end of the day, there will be this gap because both sides need to say different things which may be true, notwithstanding that. And I'll speak a little bit as to why. And I think the P5+1 view of the Iran nuclear negotiation has been very straightforward from the beginning. It's really truly an instance of pay for performance, that the Iranians will have to take certain specific nuclear steps on a specific time frame in order to get specific relief. But that's not Iran's position in looking at this negotiation. And what I think the Iranians have been very clear about is they are not seeking a transaction here. What they're seeking is a rationalization of what they perceive to be the status quo, which is that sanctions are not actually working, that in various different ways they're helping Iran or they're immaterial to Iran and so on and so forth, but that the nuclear program is proceeding regardless. And what I think they are trying to have is a nuclear deal in which there needs never be a concession that sanctions were in fact inflicting great pain on Iran. They are instead more of an inconvenience. If that's the case, then it would be very difficult for them in fact to get into a transactional conversation with the P5+1. Because to do so implies that there are costs being imposed on both sides and that those costs are to some measure equal. Well, that would cut against a lot of what Iranian rhetoric has been for a long period of time. So instead, what they have to say is sanctions will be relieved, and they have to be relieved because it would be illogical for them to remain in place. Not that, frankly, in every single negotiating round that the P5+1 has had with Iran, that they're the core of the issue, and that getting sanctions relief in a timely manner has been the Iranian position from the get-go and continues to guide what their negotiating strategy is. And I think at the end of the day, this is because they need to avoid being seen as having caved to Western pressure. I think that cuts against their domestic narratives, it cuts against their own sense of self, and it cuts against the clear negotiating instructions that they've taken from the Supreme Leader. So what they've had to do, I think, is to some degree, perform a lot of verbal gymnastics to basically say we need to get sanctions relief, it needs to happen in a timely manner, it will be done in exchange for nuclear steps, but not as some sort of quid pro quo transactional basis. Rather, it would simply be a logical outcome of a deal. So what does that really mean, though, in terms of the results of the deal? Not much. The two sides are going to talk about things in a different way, but just as the P5+1 has had to accept certain realities about Iran's nuclear program, Iran has to accept certain realities about sanctions relief. Enrichment will continue in Iran as part of this deal, but so will the presence of some sanctions for a period of time, as well as other sanctions that govern human rights, terrorism, so on and so forth. And the Iranians are going to have to reconcile themselves to that. They're going to find some way of having to describe that. And the words chosen both sides will differ and differ markedly, but Iran has already demonstrated that they're prepared to accept this lack of consistency between the positions in the P5+1 Iran joint statement of April 2nd, where they said that they would be prepared to accept terms like cease the application of U.S. sanctions as opposed to terminating them on day one. And I think what this means ultimately is that there is less actually being disagreed upon between the P5+1 and Iran on the substance, and it's more about making sure that the final day in which sanctions are supposed to be suspended is met with certain nuclear steps having been taken. So what will that day look like? In my view, I think it'll be very similar to what happened on January 20th, 2014, which we were describing at the time as a long day, in which the IAEA verified very early in the morning in Iran that certain nuclear steps had been taken. And it provided a report to Brussels, and it provided a report to Washington as to what the nature of those nuclear steps were. And we went through a list in which we reviewed what Iran had to do consistent with the Joint Plan of Action and confirmed that all those steps had been taken. And once we were able to go through that list and verify that those things had been done, we were able to trigger the sanctions relief that had been promised as part of the Joint Plan of Action. Now, Iran's going to have to do an awful lot of work in order to get there. But the Iranians have already started priming the pump and prepping their audiences for this, in Abbas Araghchi saying, for instance, that there are preliminary work that will have to be done as a way of getting ready for the day of implementation. And what I think that basically means is they will be taking steps to modify the Iraq reactor, to slow down enrichment, to remove centrifuges, to remove nuclear material, but that because it won't have been verified by the IAEA at that point, it'll all be preliminary. It'll all be something that can be reversed until such time as the IAEA confirms that all has been done. And at that point, sanctions relief can in fact start to flow. With respect to sanctions relief, there will have to be three almost simultaneous steps taken, and that's where there will be some complication. First, the UN Security Council will need to vote on a resolution that changes the character of the UN Security Council system. Now, that resolution may be set in place earlier on as part of the time lag between the signature of the deal, if such a deal is signed, and its actual starting of implementation. But the practical impact of the UN system having been changed probably won't take place until after the IAEA has verified that these nuclear steps have been taken. The EU will have to vote to modify its sanctions. And this will come likely in the form of council resolution, council statement, council conclusion that establishes a new legal basis for whatever measures still are in place, and then establishes whatever the snapback criteria are going to be for the EU. And I think on that, there's still a lot of work to be done, and I'll speak to that in a moment. And the United States will have to trigger its sanctions relief, which will be in the form of presidential waivers and State Department and Treasury Department modification of their implementation rules and regulations. Now, that'll probably be done in a variety and blizzard of paperwork, and stacks and reams of paper will be signed off on. But ultimately, what it'll come down to is a package that will go to the President, to the Secretary of State, and to the Secretary of Treasury, triggering whatever relief has been agreed to, and then establishing what the process will be for implementing what measures are still in place. I think this then will be the situation for a number of years. If what we're hearing out of the negotiations is consistent with reality, then I think everything will basically happen on one day. That there will be a verification of a variety of nuclear steps being taken in the morning, sanctions will be suspended in the afternoon, and that will be the situation that then pertains until one of two things happens. Either the Iranians cheat and sanctions snap back, or we reach the end of either a time period or some milestone that Iran's nuclear program has to achieve in which further sanctions relief will take place. And that'll largely be in the UN Security Council context and be a form of removing the existing restrictions on Iran's nuclear program, its ability to acquire sensitive items, so on and so forth. And I think at that same time, you would see then the United States begin the process of formally terminating its remaining legislation and any residual nuclear-related sanctions that have been suspended. Now, that will require new law. That will require drafting a new bill that changes the standards by which the current sanctions ought to be judged, because the termination clauses in many of these laws do in fact reflect terrorism, human rights, and other related purposes. But this is not that unusual a circumstance. Law can be changed. That's the reason why we have an active legislature. And I think the point at which we have finally decided that Iran has met certain benchmarks is when that bill can be put forward. Whether, of course, it'll be voted on in year 10, 15, or 20 is a whole separate conversation. I think I'll conclude with three items that I think are worth sort of thinking about. First is how the EU will actually take its steps. I think there's been a lot of discussion about the difference between the statements in the joint statement between the P5+ and Iran, between how the EU would take its sanctions relief and how the United States would take its sanctions relief. I think it speaks to the different nature of the legislative processes in the two places. For the EU, they have to get 28 countries together to vote to suspend or terminate legislation. They then have to have the same 28 come together to put new sanctions in place. I think the fact that the EU would be willing to consider a termination of its sanctions does not mean that there would not be the possibility of snapback. And I think that you could see a snapback rule set up such that sanctions are formally terminated by the EU, but that the EU also decides that they will come back into place if some criteria has been tripped. And this could be something as simple as an IAEA Director General's report that Iran has violated some part of the comprehensive plan of action, or it could be something much more complicated. But there is still room within a termination of EU sanctions to have some kind of snapback arrangement. On the UN, I think it'll be, frankly, a creative drafting exercise of a Security Council resolution. Paragraph 1 of a resolution will probably say something like, we terminate the existing Security Council resolutions and their various provisions. Paragraph 2 will say, except for the following paragraphs, and put them back in place. At the end of the day, this isn't rocket science. It's just simply words. And there is a way of making the words in a Security Council resolution say what you need them to say, and to reimpose the restrictions that have been agreed upon in a comprehensive plan of action. The real tricky part is getting the political agreement on what those restrictions need to be. And I think that's, again, part and parcel of the negotiations that are ongoing today. On the issue of snapback more generally, I think a lot of attention is focused on whether or not there is legal mechanism for snapback. And that, to me, is an absurd way of looking at this. Certainly there's a legal way of doing snapback. The more important issue is under what circumstances snapback would be triggered. Because I don't think it's credible that for something as innocuous as a centrifuge valve being out of place, all the sanctions regime would go back in place. And I don't think, frankly, the Iranians would be all that concerned about that, because they know that that would then risk the entire plan of action. I think the bigger issue really is differentiating between material breaches and non-material breaches, technical violations. And I think that's actually where some more useful work ought to be done. how we would respond to things that are technical violations of the deal and how we respond to material breaches of the deal. One would certainly trigger a snapback of all the sanctions that could be suspended. The other one may trigger something less, like, for instance, prohibition on the ability of an entity to engage in procurements for a year or 6 months, something like that. But there ought to be a way of structuring a system in which certain violations are treated in a certain way and other violations are treated in another way. And I think this speaks to a larger issue about snapback. Some of the debate on snapback has focused on whether or not snapback will preclude an Iranian breakout attempt. I think that's a ridiculous abstraction. If the Iranians decide to break out, sanctions are not going to be how we respond. A true Iranian breakout attempt with undeclared facilities and a brush past all the diplomatic efforts that will be taken to try and pull them back, sanctions are not going to be the way that they'll be arrested. Instead, that's when we're going to be in a place in which military force is going to have to be considered. So therefore, the real question is not how to deal with the massive breakout and whether or not sanctions can arrest that, because at that point we would be on a very shrinking timeline with limited options other than military, or how to deal with the technical small violations, which can be dealt with, but this middle space. And it's in the middle space where the need for more breakout time is so important. If the Iranians are, at a minimum, a year away from having enough enriched uranium for a bomb, that does give you plenty of time to go down the sanctions path and to escalate the pressure on the regime in a very serious way. The key issue will be context and how the United States and its partners choose to sell their decision to snap back on the sanctions. In instances in which there is widespread and systemic violations, that'll be comparatively easy. In instances in which there isn't, that's where the debate will be harder. And I think what this all again speaks to is the need to be very careful in how we design our snapback, how we sell a deal, and then how we implement the deal thereafter to ensure that we have that maximum year to address a breakout attempt in the more sneak out sort of scenario. I think I'll stop my comments there.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Ariane?
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Daryl, and the rest of the ACA team for obviously this event, but also all the hard work you guys have been doing to support this very worthy process. I'm really glad Richard brought up the issue of messaging and words, because that's what I'm going to be focusing on for the next 10 minutes. I've heard from a number of Cold Warriors that one of the shortcomings of their efforts during the US-Soviet arms control negotiations was that they often mistook rhetoric for policy. And a number of people have raised the question, are we doing the same with Iran? And the answer is yes. Every time the Supreme Leader says something, and it's very frequently, it's almost once a week, if not more, people around town start to raise questions and throw their arms in the air and say, that's it, the negotiations are going to derail, this is the end of the process, we're not going to get anything out of this. And in the next 6 weeks, I guess, is the time we have until June 30th, this is going to become increasingly a challenge because domestic dynamics in Iran there's more and more conflict within Iran on this topic. There are a number of conflicting forces, and the rhetoric is going to be increasingly conflicted and increasingly contradictory, in fact. So I want to focus on the major actors inside Iran that are going to have a say on the nuclear issue. And I want to sort of break it down and talk a little bit about what they've said so far on the negotiations and what that means for the implementation of a deal. So let's start with the Supreme Leader, obviously the person everybody thinks about when thinking about this issue. The Supreme Leader, as I said, he talks a lot, he says a lot of things, and he often says things that are interpreted as very strict red lines. For those of you who live in DC, you'll remember that about a year ago, he 1,000 separative work units to fuel Bushehr. And at that point, everybody was saying, well, that sets 190,000 SU. There's no way we're going to accept that. Nobody sat down and thought, okay, let's think about this. Do the Iranians actually have the capability to get to 190,000 SU? Obviously, the answer is no, not right now. All you had to do was read the second sentence to find out that what he was saying was, we may not need it in the next 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, but eventually we will need to get to that point. So we need enrichment, and we need to be able to get to that point at some point in the future. Why am I telling you this? Why am I reminding you of this? Because since the extension of the agreement in November 2014, there's been a number of instances where he's come out and said things that have been interpreted, again, as very strict red lines that were going to derail the process. So, for instance, shortly before the March deadline for an agreement, for a framework agreement, the Supreme Leader said, look, we don't want a phased process. We're going to have a single process, and that's going to be it. We're not going to have a framework agreement followed by a comprehensive agreement. In effect, what happened was that we did get a framework agreement, and we're going to get a comprehensive agreement in June. Likewise, when the Lausanne Agreement was announced, he said something about sanctions and whether or not sanctions should be lifted all at once, whether or not they should be lifted right after an agreement is reached. Obviously, that was interpreted, again, as, the Supreme Leader is saying that sanctions must be lifted right this instant, and that's not going to happen. So we can't have an agreement then. But again, looking at what he says and interpreting what he says, reading between the lines, essentially, indicates that every time he comes up and fixes a red line, the red line can be crossed, and it's not a strict red line. And in fact, I would argue that he has been giving flexible enough red lines for the negotiating team to be able to sell the deal domestically using the framework that has been established by the Supreme Leader. And that's exactly what the negotiating team has been doing in Iran in the past few months. Zarif, Salehi, and others in the team have been giving interviews, very long ones, in Iranian media, trying to sell the deal to their domestic constituency. And I know I'm going to get into a lot of trouble for this, but despite how conservative the Supreme Leader is on most issues, on the nuclear issue has been a moderating agent. If it wasn't for him, first of all, we wouldn't have a process. There would be no process if the Supreme Leader didn't back it. And second, if the Supreme Leader didn't step in and tell the hardliners in Iran to quiet down, essentially, there would be a lot more challenging of the agreement, of the process altogether. And the negotiating team would have a much harder time selling this deal and negotiating, in fact, than it has been having. So what he's doing is very similar, in fact, to what the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has been doing, balancing conflicting interests, balancing various domestic constituencies, but at the same time trying to negotiate because there is, I would argue, a national consensus around the idea that that negotiations need to happen, that there needs to be a deal in Iran. So the IRGC has been essentially echoing what the Supreme Leader has been saying, which is, the negotiations must happen. We back the negotiations and the negotiators. We believe that they are going to be acting within the framework of national interests. They, of course, have a lot at stake, first of all, for their sort of vague involvement in the nuclear program. Second, for reasons relating to sanctions. They have arguably benefited from sanctions. It's very obvious, walking around the streets of Tehran, you can see that they play a huge role in most areas of sort of public life. So they have been benefiting from this, and obviously a deal is going to change that dynamic to some extent. So despite having these conflicting interests, they have been supporting the negotiations. For the most part, they were very cautious in doing that. But after the Lausanne, it was a very sort of resonating endorsement. They congratulated the Supreme Leader for the children of the revolution, quote unquote, achieving what they achieved. But the biggest challenge is going to come from Majlis, and it has so far. What Majlis does is that it essentially mirrors Congress. So every time Congress does something, which is pretty frequently these days, within 3 days, you know that Majlis is going to do something as well. Most recently, they tried to pass a bill that negotiations would stop unless the United States stopped threatening Iran. That's probably not going to go anywhere, like most of what they say. But they have been trying to put a lot of pressure on the government, some members of Majlis anyway. And there are people who have a lot of influence in Majlis. But again, this is where the Supreme Leader comes into play. Because he has been backing the negotiators and the process altogether, Majlis hasn't been able to do as much as it would like to do. Ultimately, what Majlis wants is what Congress wants, which is to supervise the process. But much of the power play between Majlis and government has essentially manifested itself outside the nuclear issue, even though it is deeply connected to the nuclear issue. So, for instance, whenever Majlis wants to do something to put pressure on governments, instead of trying to push back on the nuclear issue, it says, okay, I'm going to impeach this minister. Or we're going to give you a hard time while you're trying to do this other thing on the economy or domestic issues. So a lot of the sort of domestic dynamics there have been focused on other areas, trying to stop the Rouhani government from doing things it's planned to do without necessarily crossing the red line of pushing too much on the nuclear issue. The Speaker of Majlis, even, Larijani, has come out and strongly supported the negotiators. He's not by any means someone who's sort of prone to supporting negotiations with the United States. He's not a liberal by any means, but he has come out and supported the team. Last point I want to leave you with, going back to the Supreme Leader, is that one of the issues is we tend to look at some of his statements, and they're very often connected to a big deadline. So, for instance, after Lausanne, everybody was expecting him to say something. So everybody was tuning in and waiting for him to say something. There, he didn't say his backing of the negotiations wasn't as resonating. But when he does his resonating endorsement of the process, it's generally in response to something that is happening domestically. So if the hardline newspaper Kayhan has a headline about the negotiations, the Supreme Leader might come out and say, look, I'm still behind the negotiators. But he's not going to have the same level of endorsement following international events where he knows that everybody is going to be paying attention. And I think that's sort of the going back to good cop, bad cop sort of thing, where he's saying, look, I'm fixing red lines, I'm asserting my authority, and I'm not going to give too much of a leeway so that the West doesn't think that it can get as much from Iran. So I'm going to stop here and sort of wrap it up, and I'm happy to discuss any of these in more detail in Q&A. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about. But essentially, my reading of the Lausanne Agreement is that it does meet Iranian bottom lines. Iran manages to walk away with exactly what it has said it would not negotiate on. Enrichment itself, it would not close down any facilities. Arak will remain a heavy water reactor. Now, I know that there's going to be some push and pull on, so this means that it's a bad deal for us. No, it's not. The numbers and the details of that make it a good deal for the United States, I believe. But the bottom lines, the sort of big things that Iran wanted to achieve, it's managed to get out of this. So with this in mind, I think that the comprehensive deal, if it sort of follows what we've seen so far, is going to be something that is going to be sellable in Iran. The problem, though, is sanctions, going back to Richard's presentation. The issue of sanctions is that with the Lausanne agreements, unlike everything else, which was very much detailed in the agreement, the sanctions bit was not. And so there's been a lot of push and pull in Iran about sanctions. Zarif, Salehi, and others have made it clear that they would get sanctions relief once Iran started to implement the agreement. But that's not fully clear for most Iranians, I think. And so far, there's been a lot of back and forth on this. I suspect there's going to be a lot more once we get closer to the June 30th deadline, and I suspect that there's going to be a lot more going on in Majlis on that front. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Great, thank you both for excellent presentations. Both of our speakers did a great job sticking to the time limits, probably because I threatened to kick them under the table if they didn't. So that luckily leaves us plenty of time for questions. So we'll start here with Barbara.
Thanks, Kelsey. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Can you explain how Snapback is supposed to work for the UN Security Council? The Russians, yet again, are saying there will be no automaticité, to use the French phrase. So how do you arrange this in such a way that it doesn't take away their veto right? Also, you talk about one long day, but if memory serves, it took a very long time to implement many aspects of the JPOA. They didn't get the channel for humanitarian transactions, I think, until 4 or 5 months after the implementation had been promised. So is it going to also be a very slow process to have all the various provisions implemented? Thank you.
Sure. So I would say a couple things. On the UN side, I think that's clearly something that still has to be negotiated, but I can give you a couple of thoughts and guesses. I mean, first is, what does automatic snapback mean, right? If some people think it means the moment that there is any breach whatsoever detected, sanctions snap back on, well then okay, that kind of automaticity might not be there. Right? It might not be the case that the moment, within seconds, of the IAEA Director General finding something that's out of joint, that sanctions are back in place. The real question is more of whether or not the time lag and the process between detection of a violation and reimposition of sanctions has got places where people can say no and turn it back off, right? It may be that there has to be a prolonged review process. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a vote yes or no, right? But there may be a prolonged review process for a couple of weeks while whatever the issue is discussed at the IAEA Board of Governors in some sort of emergency process or an emergency meeting of the Security Council. But that if, for instance, there is not an agreement of the Security Council not to reimpose sanctions, that sanctions get reimposed automatically. In other words, there may be a role to be played by every member of the Security Council to vote yes or no, right? But the question of whether or not that vote flips the logic here, that's up for debate, I think. And I would just sort of note, while it's true the Russians and Chinese have probably been the most vocal in talking about the need for the veto, they're not the only ones. I mean, the U.S. has got an interest in the veto of the Security Council resolutions remaining in place. So does France, so does the U.K. I mean, a lot of countries might not like that, but at the end of the day, the 5 veto holders do want to hold their vetoes, and it's an important asset they want to keep. So I would just sort of say I think there is a way of navigating the veto issue that gives countries a say, a chance to influence what the process is, but that does not mean that there cannot be a defined process that leads to sanctions coming back in place while the debates are still going on, or if the debates are unresolved, at the end of some number of days or something like that. In terms of the long day, what I would say about the sanctions relief and how that manifested, it is not true that the channel did not exist on day one. The humanitarian channel existed on day one, January 20th, 2014. Adam Zubin signed a number of different pieces of paper that authorized the humanitarian transactions, and frankly, those were already embedded in law anyway. The issue that we had was finding banks that were prepared to make that happen. Well, that's a different issue, right? That's a commercial issue. That's an issue of finding a bank that's willing to do it. And the amount of time we had from when we had the first discussions on implementation with the Iranians in December to when it got implemented, that was a fairly short number of days to be able to get a bank to put itself, as it saw it, at risk. So what I would say is this, from a legal perspective, I think that it's certainly true sanctions relief will be effective the day that paper is signed. And I would imagine that would be on the beginning of this long day. That does not mean that commercial deals will start that day, right? And I actually think the real concern that the Iranians ought to have is that there are going to be banks out there saying, I'm not getting involved in Iran until I've seen 6 months of compliance, a year of compliance. That is not an issue of sanctions. That is an issue of questioning whether or not there's going to be a violation, that sanctions have to be snapped back, et cetera. But I think that's an implementation challenge that is simply going to have to be dealt with through messaging and things like that.
Okay. Let's take 2 questions this time. Joseph, we have the gentleman here in the middle, and then Sherman, right there.
Hi, Jim Goodby, not Brookings, but Hoover Institution. I am concerned about the dynamic underway now between the Sunni Arabs and the Iranians in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen. And I'm wondering if that dynamic is going to continue. Probably so, unless there's some change radically in the way the Revolutionary Guard see their role. And isn't it going to be very difficult to insulate the nuclear agreement from those other things going on in the Middle East? I would think that would be the major threat to the whole process, not the specifics, technicalities, if you will, of the nuclear agreement.
Yeah. Thank you.
Avis Bolin, retired Foreign Service officer. I have a question for Richard Nephew. Could you review for us, maybe this is elementary for some of the other members of the audience, but what will be the sanctions, the U.S. sanctions that will come off on this long day one, and what will be the ones that will be left by the legislation? Thank you.
Thank you. Ariane, perhaps you could take Jim's question, and then Richard can take Avis's.
So on the question about Sunni Arabs and Iran, yep, that's there's there's a lot going on, and unfortunately, it's not going anywhere. In Iraq specifically, Iran feels a direct threat to its territorial integrity because of ISIS. So it is going to remain involved in Iraq as long as ISIS is there, as long as the Iraqi situation doesn't change. With regard to Syria, it's not as clear. Iran doesn't have as a vital threat as it does in Iraq, but it's still going to remain very much involved, especially now that it seems like the tides are turning and Iran believes, I think, that they have been right on Assad. Now that the prospect of regime change is no longer really there. Is that going to have an impact on the negotiations? I don't think so. I mean, all these issues have been ongoing for the past 2 years, and the ISIS threat, Iran's involvement became very obvious already a year ago, and yet the negotiations have been ongoing. So I don't see a threat from. Sorry for the pun, but yeah, I don't see a threat from that issue for the nuclear negotiations.
And on the issue of sanctions, it's easier really to talk about what's not coming off as opposed to what's coming on, I think, because it's a much more distinct group. I think it's very obvious that the terrorism and human rights specific sanctions are going to remain in place. So that includes things like Iran remaining a state sponsor of terrorism, designations of individual Iranian entities and people will remain in place if they were sanctioned for involvement in terrorism and human rights violations. I mean, those things will remain in place. I think it's also highly likely that the U.S. unilateral embargo will remain in place as well, right? So what did the P5+1 and Iran joint statement talk about? It talked about secondary sanctions. Well, secondary sanctions is a term of art, basically meaning U.S. interference in third-party business with Iran. But the U.S. unilateral embargo with regard to Iran hasn't been talked about as coming off. So I think it's still highly likely that General Motors and General Electric and any other U.S. company or bank you can talk about is probably not going to be going into Iran unless it's under a specific license for specific things, like an aircraft spare parts. That's part of the joint plan of action. In terms of what's coming off at that point, you're basically then talking about the entire structure of sanctions that have affected Iran's ability to do international financing, international transport, and international energy, including having energy companies come in and help Iran with investment and structuring its fields. Does that help?
Great, thanks. And I'd like to remind everybody, too, that the closing keynote will be given by Colin Kahl, the National Security Advisor to the Vice President, so some of your questions may be better directed to him. But Shervin, let's go to the back, and if we could take Joe's question and then Andrea's question as well.
Thank you very much, Joe Cirincione, Plowshares Fund, and thank you, Arms Control Association, for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking set of panels today. This is for Professor Tabatabai. I was struck by your comment of confusing statements for policy. So do you have an assessment of what you think the Supreme Leader's policy is right now on the Lausanne Agreement? That is, if we actually translate this into a final agreement, is he inclined to do it, and if so, why?
Hi, Andrea Berger, Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. A quick comment, if I may, sort of a reaction to one of the speakers, and then a question to Ariane. On the potential lag from the banking sector, it strikes me that actually that lag may come not necessarily as a result of banks wanting to see 6 months or a year of compliance, but banks maybe not being able to navigate what becomes a need for a nuanced picture. Banks have been used to doing this sort of blanket risk-based approach to implementing sanctions where they don't do business with Iran. That's very easy for them. They see an Iranian end user or suspect an Iranian end user. They don't process that transaction. Well, now we're getting into a sanctions landscape where they're going to have some sanctions on Iran. They're still going to have counterproliferation finance obligations from 1540, and it's going to become much more difficult for them to distinguish between a transaction that they're allowed to process with an Iranian end user and one that they probably should avoid. And I think it might take banks a little while to figure out exactly how to do that. And I think the lag may come from that partially as a result, perhaps in addition to the questions over Iranian compliance. But a question to Ariane briefly. You talked about mirror imaging between effectively the legislative bodies of the US and Iran. And I wonder, we're having this discussion in the US over how to determine what might be material breach. Do you foresee that same discussion happening in Iran over what would be non-compliance on the part of the rest of the parties to this agreement? If there's a delay in releasing certain funds, for example, how long does the delay have to be before it becomes viewed as material breach by Iran? Is that discussion happening?
Yeah, let me start with Joe's question. So my assessment of the Supreme Leader's policy so far is that he is cautiously sort of agreeing to what is going on. It would be a mistake to think that the Supreme Leader doesn't know exactly what's happening, what's on the table at Lausanne or now in Vienna or wherever it is they are these days. Because, you know, he has a direct channel to the negotiating team. Ararchi, one of the negotiators, is within the Supreme Leader's circle. So I don't foresee a scenario where essentially he would be presented with an agreement and he would say, hey, what is this? I've never seen this. I don't think I can sign up to this. I think that he is aware of the details, even though, again, and this is where policy and rhetoric should be distinguished, he said that he doesn't know the details. He knows broadly what's going on, but he doesn't have an understanding of the details. I believe he does, and I believe that if he is letting the negotiations go this far, it indicates that he is willing to sign up to the final deal. Obviously, you know, the framework agreement has essentially outlined the most important concessions Iran will have to make. And so if he wasn't okay with this, he would have said something, he would have done something, and yet the negotiations are going on. Language is now being negotiated in various venues, and I think that that's a good indication that he's on board. Now we'll have to see what happens ultimately, but I think that he's aware of what's going on and he's on board with this. Andrea, your question about mirroring of legislative bodies, what is Majlis talking about these days? My answer is not to the same level as in the US. There's not as much detail being discussed. And frankly, I think that Majlis is more busy right now trying to put pressure on the Rouhani government and sort of to have an impact on the process itself to talk about non-compliance. That said, yes, there have been a number of sort of discussions about non-compliance on this side. The Supreme Leader again has come out and said, "Look, we can't trust the U.S. We know that there may never be sanctions relief in the end," and that's something that has been echoed by Majlis, by Iranian media, saying we may not get sanctions relief ultimately, but we are trying. And so the discussion is not as detailed as it has been here. And I think another part of that, it has to do with the fact that there has not been an Iranian equivalent of the fact sheet that we had in the U.S., which sort of laid out all the issues or broke down all the technical issues. And so Iran has not really dominated, has not really shaped that part of the discussion domestically.
Okay. I'm going to give Richard a chance just to respond to your comment.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, I think that's a good point about how the implementation side of the relief is going to lag, just in part because banks have to figure out their due diligence requirements and things like that. The only thing I would say, though, is, to some extent, that's all going to be dictated by their customers. If they get big, customers, big energy companies, for instance, that want to start doing business inside of Iran, they'll sort themselves out relatively quickly. I think ultimately the real issue is it's going to be a combination of pressures on banks and on companies to decide how they want to translate relief. It'll be made easier if relief is all in one big hunk and if they've got 6 months to prepare for it, right? Because then they can work through all the due diligence requirements that they will have to have in place for that day when sanctions relief is triggered. It would be quite different if all of a sudden the deal were to be implemented on the 1st of September. I think that's when you'll see even greater lag as they struggle to catch up. But ultimately, I think the bigger question is, will they decide to go in? Sure, they will decide to go in, and they'll decide to go in when they have customers wanting to go in, when they've got confidence that they're not going to have the rug pulled out from under them, and when they're confident that the reputational risks that they would take from doing so would be fairly modest.
Great, thanks. I'll take a question here in the center, Joseph, and then up here in front, please.
Thank you. I'm Norman Wolfe, formerly of the State Department. One question for Mr. Nephew is on the verification side. Is it going to be additional protocol alone, additional protocol plus? Could you make a few comments on that? And the second question is, do either of you see that if the agreement is successfully implemented, that leading to any changes in Iranian behavior in other areas like terrorism, Hezbollah, et cetera?
Great, Joseph, and then if you could come down here to the front, please.
Richard Golden, member of the association. In the entire process, at this point, is Israel irrelevant?
Richard, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Can I not answer that question? I'll be brave. I'll take a whirl at that. No, Israel is not irrelevant to this at all. I think, look, the idea that the United States has not taken on board the concerns of Israel with regard to this deal is simply false. I spent as many hours talking with Israeli government colleagues as I did with the U.S. Congress whenever we were out of sessions with the Iranians, and that was 18 months worth of process. I think that the fact that there was a secret set of conversations with the Iranians for a few months before the big process emerged in November of 2013 has colored people's impressions of the amount of engagement that this government is having with the Israeli government. The simple reality is there were video conferences, trips to Israel, trips from the Israelis to Washington. There was lots of conversations. Israel's thinking and some of their specific comments and reactions formed the basis of positions that we took in the talks. Not the sole basis, but a basis, provided information, provided context, provided concerns. And I would just sort of say that Israel was relevant to our policy as we were approaching it before I left the government in December, and I am quite certain that Israeli concerns, at least at a technical level, are part of the process now. So no, I don't think they're irrelevant at all, and they certainly won't be irrelevant going forward as this thing is implemented. On the issue of whether or not at a political level it'll interfere with doing a deal or not, that I think has been demonstrated already that the Obama administration wants to proceed. On the issue of AP plus, I would say this. I would say that certainly is the case the additional protocol and its implementation will be part of this. As you know quite well, there are ways to implement the additional protocol, and then there are ways to implement the additional protocol. And if you implement the AP very aggressively, and if there's agreement, for instance, that when the IEA says, I got to go to this facility or that facility, that it gets granted that access, that itself is not per se the additional protocol, but it's an enhanced implementation of the additional protocol. I personally would guess, not in government anymore, so I'm just guessing, but I would guess that that's the kind of thing we're going to see. We're going to see a aggressive implementation of the additional protocol, but enough that gives the Iranians very clear legal ability to say, we're just implementing the additional protocol, but gets the access and transparency that the United States and its partners really need to see in Iran on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I'll just add to the I'll answer the question about the behavior. Will Iran change its behavior following a deal? Well, I guess the answer is it depends. In some places it won't. Again, on Iraq, there is a very clear sort of threat to national security as far as the Iranians are concerned. So Iran's behavior is not going to change. That said, there might be some more cooperation with the United States. And I say this, I go back to the Supreme Leader. I don't know, I've been talking a lot about him today. In one of his many speeches recently, he said that the nuclear negotiations serve as a test for Iran-U.S. relations. That's not something that has been widely reported here, but that's something that he said, and that is kind of, it's a pretty big deal. He hadn't said this for a very long time, as far as I remember. So that might actually provide some grounds for further Iran-U.S. Coordination anyway. On a number of other issues, it may change Iran's behavior. In places where Iran doesn't have a clear interest, where it's really just trying to poke the U.S. in the eye or Saudis in the eye, it might change a little bit. But I think that it's very much a case-by-case basis that we need to look at this issue. But I think the sort of general assessment within the Iran's regional sort of power play is, no, it's not going to change too much.
Great, thank you both. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this panel, but I would urge everyone to stay in their seats as we transition to our last keynote. And before that, please join me in thanking both of our panelists.